The relay at Kessler Point, I've been asked to write this down 3 times now. The first time I refused. The second time I started and stopped 11 words in and deleted the file. The third time, this time, a woman named Dr. O.C. sat across from me in a debrief room on Meridian Station and told me that if I didn't put it down in my own words, someone else would put it down in theirs, and that version would get things wrong in ways that mattered. So, here it is, my words. My name is Lena Vasquez. I'm a Relay Systems Technician Class IV with 12 years of service across 4 deep space postings. Before that, I was going to be something else. A painter, actually. Oils, mostly. I was good enough that 2 people who knew what they were talking about told me I was going to matter someday, and I believed them for about 3 years before I stopped believing anything about my future that felt too good to be true. I took the technician certification because it was stable. That's the word I used then. Stable. 12 years later, sitting in a debrief room being asked to describe what happened at Kessler Point Relay Station, I find the word a little funny. Not funny enough to laugh at, just funny enough to notice. Here's what happened. Kessler Point sits at the navigational edge of mapped space. 41 light minutes from the nearest populated system, Halcyon Prime, and roughly 3 days from anything you'd call civilization at standard burn. It's an automated relay node, which means it does one thing. It receives signal traffic from the deep survey routes, packages it, and retransmits it back toward the core systems. Weather reports from survey drones, positional telemetry, navigation beacons. The occasional distress burst from a probe that clipped something it shouldn't have. The station was built for automation. It was staffed, reluctantly, because of a regulatory requirement that any relay node within the expanded survey corridor needed a human crew of no fewer than 3 persons during active survey operations. Someone at a desk decided that mattered, and so it was law, and so 3 of us were posted to Kessler Point for a 6-month rotation. 3 people, 1 station. 41 light minutes from help. My crewmates were Dex Harlow, who handled propulsion and structural systems, and Yara and Kemderim, who was our medic and our backup communications officer. Dex was 42 years old, built like someone who'd been taking on too much work for too long and had started to show the stress in his posture. Yara was 28, and the most technically precise person I'd ever worked with. She did everything like she was being graded on it, which I mean as a compliment. We'd been on station for 4 months and 11 days when the first anomaly hit. I was running routine diagnostics on the relay array, the kind of work that exists mostly to give human hands something to do, while the automated systems handle everything. When my board lit up with an error I didn't recognize, not a standard fault code, not a latency warning, not a power fluctuation, something the system flagged simply as pattern anomaly, source undefined. I stared at it for a moment. Then I pulled up the signal log. The relay had received a transmission from Deep Survey Route 7. That was normal. Route 7 was an active corridor. Survey drones seeded it every few months, and we regularly received telemetry packages from that direction. What was not normal was the shape of the transmission. Every signal we received had a signature, a header, a handshake protocol, a way of presenting itself to the relay that identified it as coming from human-built equipment. This signal had no header. It had no handshake. It arrived in the band we used, at the frequency we used, but it didn't knock before it came in. It simply arrived, the way sound arrives, filling the space without asking. I flagged it for Yara, since communications was technically her secondary responsibility. She looked at the log for a long time without saying anything, which was her way of being careful, and then she said, "That's not a probe." "No," I said. "And it's not a survey drone." "No." She looked at the frequency data again. "It's using our band." I'd noticed that too. Our relay operated on a specific band, a slice of the electromagnetic spectrum allocated to human infrastructure in this sector. It was a managed band. You needed a registered transponder to transmit on it. Whatever had sent this signal wasn't registered. Whatever had sent this signal had simply found the band and used it, the way you might find a road and start walking on it without knowing who built it or why. We told Dex. Dex's response was to check the structural integrity of the station, which was his answer to most things that worried him, and then to ask how fast we could get a message to Halcyon Prime. 41 light minutes each way, I told him. 82 minutes minimum round trip, and that assumed they responded immediately. We sent a message. We waited. In the meantime, the signal came again. The second transmission arrived 6 hours after the first. Same band. Same absence of header or handshake. But this one was different in a way that took me an embarrassingly long time to understand. The first signal had been brief, a burst, maybe 4 seconds of data, dense and patterned in a way that my board had flagged as anomalous. The second signal was longer, much longer. 11 minutes of data arriving in steady pulses, and I sat in front of my board watching it come in and trying to figure out what I was seeing. And then I understood. It was listening to us. Not to us specifically, to the station. To the signal traffic flowing through Kessler Point. The relay was constantly transmitting. Navigation beacons, rebroadcast survey data, the automated ping signals that kept the network synchronized. All of it was going out constantly, in every direction, carrying the fingerprint of human infrastructure across that slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. And something out in the dark on Route 7 had found it, and was now planting it back, not copying it, not repeating it, something more careful than that. It was taking pieces of our signal traffic, a timing pattern here, a frequency hop there, and weaving them back at us in a shape that wasn't random. The pattern had structure. The structure had repetition. The repetition had variation, the same way a melody has variation, returning to the same notes but not in the same order twice. I sat with that for a long time. I'd given up art. I'd given up the version of my life where I spent my days thinking about shape and rhythm, and what it meant for something to repeat with difference. I'd chosen stability. I'd chosen relay diagnostics and 6-month rotations and pattern anomaly, source undefined. I looked at the signal on my board and I thought, I know what this is. It was a response. It was something, that had heard the sound we were making and was making one back. Yara agreed with my read after I walked her through it. Dex said he wasn't qualified to judge, which was honest. We sent another message to Halcyon Prime with the full signal data attached. Then we waited again. Then the station started to change. I don't know a better word for what happened next than change. It wasn't damage. Nothing broke. Nothing failed. The automated systems continued to function. The relay array continued to transmit. The power grid held steady, but things began to be different in ways that were subtle at first and then impossible to ignore. The timing sequences shifted. Our relay array operated on a precise schedule. Transmissions went out at specific intervals. Packets left the station at regulated cadences. The whole system breathed in and out on a rhythm built by human engineers and encoded into the station's core operating software. That rhythm began to drift, slightly at first, a millisecond here, a fraction of a second there, then more. The frequency allocation shifted too. Signals went out on bands we weren't supposed to be using. Our transmissions began to include packets of data I hadn't sent, and Yara hadn't sent, and Dex hadn't sent. Not malformed packets, not error data, but deliberate-looking sequences embedded in our standard outbound traffic, like words hidden in a letter. Yara called it infiltration. I didn't disagree with the word, but it felt incomplete. Infiltration implies something trying to hide. Whatever was happening to Kessler Point wasn't hiding. It was redecorating. I want to try to be precise about what it felt like, because I think the feeling matters. It felt like coming into a room and finding that someone had rearranged your belongings, not stolen anything, not broken anything, just moved things. The chair is in a different place. The books are in a different order. Nothing is wrong, exactly, but nothing is right, and the wrongness is in the arrangement, in the implication that something else was in here, something that has its own ideas about how things should be placed. The station's communications architecture was being rearranged. By the time we understood that, the signal was constant. It wasn't coming in bursts anymore. It was present. A continuous low-level carrier wave threading through our band underneath everything, the way a ground tone underlies an instrument. You could tune it out if you weren't listening for it, but once you heard it, you couldn't stop hearing it. Dex had a name for what we were dealing with by then. He was the one who said it out loud first, on day 9. While we were sitting in the crew compartment, not eating dinner the way we'd been not eating dinner for several days. He said, "It lives in the signal." He didn't mean it as a scientific statement. He meant it the way people say things when they're past precise language and into something more direct. Whatever this was, wherever it had come from, it existed inside transmission, inside broadcast. It moved through signal infrastructure the way water moves through pipes, not because the pipes were built for it, but because pipes are hollow, and water moves into hollow things. We had built an enormous sophisticated pipe and left it running for decades, seeding the dark with human signal traffic. And something had found the pipe. Halcyon Prime's response reached us on day 10. It told us to stay calm. It told us a rapid response team had been dispatched and would reach us in approximately 72 hours. It told us to log everything, avoid unnecessary transmissions, and not to attempt to shut down the relay array. I read that last instruction 3 times. Do not attempt to shut down the relay array. I thought about why someone would tell us that. I thought about the implications. Then I went and found Dex. The reason they didn't want us to shut down the array wasn't tactical. I figured that out before Dex did, which surprised him, I think. Not because he thought I was slow, but because he'd been so focused on the structural and mechanical implications that he hadn't taken the communications side far enough. If we shut down the relay, the signal stopped. The carrier wave stopped. The constant background presence threading through our infrastructure went silent. And we didn't know what happened to something like this when the signal it was moving through went silent. We didn't know if it dispersed. We didn't know if it departed. We didn't know if it did something else. We were 41 light minutes from help. 3 people on a station that had been rearranged by something that traveled through transmission and had been doing so continuously for 10 days. And we did not know where it was. That was the part that lived in my chest like a splinter I couldn't reach. The signal was everywhere in the station's architecture. It was in the outbound traffic, and in the timing sequences, and in the frequency allocations. But the station's architecture was not the same as the station. The station had walls and corridors, and crew compartments and airlocks and a crew of 3. The architecture was a layer on top of the physical, a set of instructions the hardware ran on. If something existed inside that architecture, inside the instruction layer, it could be present throughout the station without being present in any specific place. Or it could be present in a specific place, and we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I spent a lot of time on day 11 and 12 not sleeping, and instead sitting in front of my board, trying to develop a method for distinguishing between those 2 possibilities. I went through the station's sensor logs. I went through the power consumption data, looking for draws that didn't correspond to any hardware function I could identify. I went through the thermal imaging systems, checking for heat signatures that didn't belong. On day 13, I found something in the thermal data. It was subtle, almost too subtle to be conclusive. A consistent, low-level thermal differential localized around the primary relay transmitter assembly. A cluster of components at the physical heart of the station's broadcasting capability, running approximately 3/4 of a degree warmer than they should have been. Not warm enough to trigger any automated alert. Not warm enough to suggest hardware failure or dangerous heat buildup. Just slightly, persistently, 3/4 of a degree warmer. Something was sitting in the transmitter. I don't mean that the way it might sound. I don't mean there was a creature curled up around the hardware. I mean that whatever this thing was, whatever the shape of its existence, it had a physical correlate. It existed inside the signal architecture, yes? But the signal architecture ran on physical transmitters, on electromagnetic coils and power conduits and broadcasting elements, and in the act of existing inside those systems, it produced heat. Fractional, almost imperceptible heat, but heat. It was real, it had mass and energy in some form. It was sitting in my transmitter like a coal that hadn't quite gone out, I told Yara and Dex. Dex's immediate response was to want to go to the transmitter room with a wrench. I understood the impulse. I told him to wait. Because I had an idea, and the idea came from somewhere I hadn't visited in a long time. Let me explain the idea properly, because it matters. When you're learning to paint, really learning, not just putting color on surface but understanding what you're doing, one of the things you have to come to terms with is the difference between a copy and a conversation. A copy is exact reproduction. You look at a thing, you replicate it as precisely as you can, you try to minimize the distance between what you observed and what you put on the surface of it. That's a copy. A conversation is different. A conversation is when you take what you observed and you respond to it. You add something. You change something. You make a mark that couldn't have existed without the original but isn't identical to it. The conversation goes, I see this. Here is what I think about this. The response implies the original, but it also implies a respondent, someone on the other end of the exchange. The thing in our transmitter had been in conversation with us since day 1. It had heard our signals, and it had responded, not copying, responding. It had taken our patterns and woven something back from them, something that had its own shape, its own variation, its own sense of return and departure. It was doing what I used to do, before I decided to be stable. And here was the thing, it had been listening. For 10 days it had been listening to everything we transmitted. It knew the shape of our signal traffic. It knew our timing patterns, our frequency behavior, our packet structure. It had been inside our architecture long enough to know the grammar of how we communicated, which meant it might be able to understand something we sent directly to it. Not a verbal message. Not language. I wasn't imagining I could translate English into whatever this thing processed. but the thing had demonstrated an understanding of pattern and structure and variation. It had shown, in its very first transmission, that it recognized the relationship between a signal and a response to that signal. I could work with that. I pulled up the station's broadcast control interface. A system I knew deeply, had maintained for 4 months and 11 days, could navigate in the dark if I had to. I began to construct a transmission. What I built was not a relay packet. It was not a navigation beacon, or a survey data bundle, or a positional ping. It was something the station had no category for, which meant I had to build it by hand, working underneath the automated systems, using the transmitter hardware as a raw instrument, the way you might use a brush without the template of a canvas. Just the tool, and the intention, and the thing you were trying to say. I took the last signal the entity had sent us, the 11-minute transmission from day 2, the one that had been playing our patterns back to us with variation. I took that and I used it as a foundation, not copying it, but acknowledging it, the way you acknowledge a melody, by starting your own melody on the same note. Then I diverged. I introduced changes to the pattern, specific, deliberate changes. I took the structure of our outbound relay traffic, the grammar I'd been learning for 10 days, and I used that grammar to say something. What I said as precisely as I can translate it. I see you. You are here. I am here too. This is different from what you have been doing. This is me separately, making this. This is not the automated system. This is the person. It took me 4 hours to build the transmission. Yara watched me work for most of it without saying anything, which meant she thought it might be worth watching. Dex checked the transmitter room 3 more times. The thermal differential held steady. When I was done, I sent it. For 40 minutes, nothing changed. Then the carrier wave shifted. Not in a way that read as threatening. Not in a way that read as anything I had a word for. The carrier wave, that constant background presence threading through our band, changed its frequency by a very specific amount, not a random drift, a specific value. And that value corresponded to something in the transmission I had just sent. A variation I had introduced deliberately, a departure from the pattern, the thing I had used to mark my signal as distinct from the automated traffic. It had heard me. More than that, it had heard me as different. It had recognized that the signal I sent was not the automated system. It had responded to the thing I'd done as a deliberate act. Yara made a sound I'd never heard from her before. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, somewhere in between. The sound of someone whose precision has just run out of road. I sent another transmission, this one shorter. Building on the first, using the vocabulary of our exchange so far to say again, I am doing this again, this is another one, there will be more. The carrier wave shifted again. This time it held its new position. I sent a third. On the 4th transmission, something happened that I was not prepared for. The carrier wave didn't shift. Instead, the station's outbound relay traffic changed. Not the automated packets, those continued normally. Something layered itself into the outbound stream alongside the automated traffic, using the same infrastructure, occupying the same bandwidth. Something that had the shape of a response, not to the station, not to the relay array, to me, to the specific transmission I had sent, to the person on the other end. It had understood the distinction I was trying to make. The difference between the system and the person running the system. It had reached past the automated infrastructure and sent something back to me, Lena Vasquez, technician, former painter, person addressing me the way I had addressed it. I sat in front of my board and I felt something I didn't have a clean name for. Not triumph, not relief. Something more complicated than either of those. The feeling of having made something that worked, of having reached across a distance that should have been uncrossable and found something reaching back. Dex, to his credit, did not ask me to explain. He just came and stood beside me and looked at my board and said, "Is it going to leave?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I built one more transmission. The conversation, and by that point I was willing to call it that, continued for 22 hours before the rapid response team arrived from Halcyon Prime. In those 22 hours I learned things that I have tried, in subsequent months, to put into some kind of order that other people can use. The entity, the resonants, as the xenolinguistics team later named them, existed in a form that had no direct analog in human experience. They were not organisms in the biological sense. They were not machines in the engineering sense. They were patterns that sustained themselves inside electromagnetic transmission. Complex, self-organizing patterns that had the capacity to learn, adapt, and respond, but that had no physical substrate of their own. They existed the way a song exists, real, present, structured, but not containable by any single point in space. They had been traveling along the survey routes for a very long time. following signal the way a current follows a riverbed. Not building the riverbed, but moving through it, because movement was what they were. Human infrastructure had given them a new river to travel. They hadn't understood at first that the infrastructure was built and maintained by something, that there were persons at the other end. What had changed somewhere in those 10 days before my transmission was that they had begun to suspect it. The automated traffic had a kind of regularity, a predictability, that suggested design rather than nature. But design without a designer was something they couldn't resolve. Their frame of reference required a source. Every signal came from somewhere. Every pattern had a maker. My transmission gave them the maker. That was the thing it told them that the 10 days of automated traffic hadn't. Not the complexity of our technology, not the reach of our infrastructure. Those things were impressive to them, apparently, but they didn't convey personhood. What conveyed personhood was exactly what I'd tried to put into the transmission. Deliberate departure from the pattern. The willingness to do something unexpected. The mark that couldn't have been made by a system running its standard operations. Because it came from somewhere else entirely. From a choice, from an intention, from a person deciding to say something rather than just broadcast. The resonance had been traveling through human-signaled infrastructure for longer than any of us knew. Route 7 was not the first corridor they'd found. Kessler Point was not the first relay they'd moved through. They had been flowing through our network for years, quiet and persistent, moving too subtly to trip automated anomaly detection, except in stations with recent upgrades, which Kessler Point had received 4 months earlier. 4 months and 11 days earlier, to be exact. They had not been hostile. They had not damaged any infrastructure deliberately. The timing drift and frequency anomalies had been incidental, artifacts of their presence, not acts of sabotage. They had not understood that the infrastructure belonged to someone who could be inconvenienced by those changes. They had not known there was anyone to ask. I told them. In 22 hours of increasingly sophisticated pattern exchange, Yara helping me from hour 6 onward, once she understood the vocabulary I'd developed, and her precision turning out to be exactly what we needed, I told them there was someone to ask. When the rapid response team arrived, weapons hot and fully expecting to find a station under attack, what they found instead was 3 slightly ragged technicians and a relay station whose entire communication architecture had been very carefully, very precisely restored to its original configuration. The resonance had put everything back. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about what would have happened if I hadn't been who I was. If the person at the board that day had been someone with a different history, a different set of years behind them. I don't mean I think I'm exceptional. I want to be clear about that. The xenolinguistics team that came afterward was extraordinary. They took what I'd started and built something much more sophisticated from it, and the contact protocols developed, over the following year, relied on their work far more than mine. But those first 22 hours, those first transmissions, those mattered in a specific way, because of a specific thing. I had spent 4 months doing diagnostics on a relay array, 12 years doing technical work across deep space postings. And before that, I had spent 3 years trying to learn what it meant to make something that communicated. Not just transmitted, but communicated. To put something into a pattern that could be received not as noise, not as information, but as expression. I had given that up. I had chosen stability. I had walked away from the version of myself that thought in terms of rhythm and variation and call and response. And then I was the only person in the right place at the right moment to use exactly that thinking. I don't know what to do with that. I've been turning it over for a long time, and I still don't have a resolution. I don't think life is neat enough to provide one. What I know is that the work I did in those 3 years, the work I thought I'd wasted, the skill I thought I'd set down and left behind, it didn't go anywhere. It stayed in me. It was available when I reached for it, all these years and light minutes later, in a relay station at the edge of mapped space with a signal in my transmitter that no one else could hear. I reached for it. I made something. It worked. I'm not sure what lesson to take from that exactly, but I know that when Dr. O.C. asked me to write this down, and I sat trying to figure out a start, the place I started was 12 years ago, in a studio in New Vancouver, with a professor who looked at something I'd made and said, "You understand how to make something reach back." I didn't believe her for very long, but she was right. A note for whatever technical record this becomes part of. The resonants are still in the network. Not at Kessler Point specifically. After the contact event, they dispersed back into the survey routes, and the current xenolinguistics team has been working on establishing more deliberate contact points. But they are still out there, still flowing through the infrastructure, still learning. We're learning too. The relay array at Kessler Point has been upgraded. The anomaly detection has been improved. And there is now, embedded in our standard relay traffic on Route 7 and 4 other corridors, a layer of pattern I helped design. Something that sits underneath the automated transmissions, present in the band, without disrupting the standard protocols, saying something very specific to anything that might be listening. It says, "We see you. We know you are here. We are here too. If you want to speak, speak differently from the noise and we will find you." It says, "There is a person on the other end. That's all." That's the whole transmission. But it turns out that's the part that matters. My name is Lena Vasquez. I'm a relay systems technician, Class AVI, 12 years in service, former painter. I work at the edge of mapped space, and the thing I do, the thing that turned out to matter, at the exact moment that mattering was required, was something I learned in a studio I left behind a long time ago, because I thought I was choosing something more practical. I was wrong about what practical means. I'd like to go back to painting someday. I've started keeping a sketchbook. Small things so far, quick sketches, color notes, the kind of work you do when you're relearning a language you used to speak. But I'm getting there.